There's a window that opens every single night for about 11 minutes, right before you fall asleep, and almost nobody knows it's there. Most people spend that window scrolling, or worrying, or falling asleep to nothing at all. A small number of people, without ever calling it a technique, have been using it for decades to quietly rebuild their entire financial reality from the inside out. I'm not going to ask you to believe me. I'm going to ask you to test it tonight, and to keep the results to yourself. Not because there's anything to hide, but because the moment you tell someone, you change what happens in your own mind. That part isn't superstition. It's something Napoleon Hill wrote about directly, and something modern neuroscience has quietly confirmed since. By the middle of this video, you'll understand exactly what to do in those 11 minutes, and why silence is the part that actually makes it work. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success, so I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me tell you exactly what happens to your brain in the minutes before sleep, because almost nobody has ever explained it to you plainly, and once you understand it, you'll never look at bedtime the same way again. Right now, while you're awake and reading this, a part of your mind is working overtime just to keep you skeptical. It checks everything. It compares what you're hearing against what you already believe, and it rejects anything that doesn't fit, which is a useful function most of the day, and the exact reason most people can sit through 100 motivational videos and walk away unchanged 5 minutes later. That gatekeeper never sleeps while you're alert, but it does, eventually, get tired. And in the minutes right before you drift off, sleep researchers call it the hypnagogic state. That gatekeeper loosens its grip almost completely. Your brainwaves shift out of the fast, analytical rhythm of full wakefulness and into a slower pattern, closer to what shows up during deep meditation. The critical mind steps back. The door, for a short while, is left open. You've actually felt this yourself, probably without naming it. That strange half-world right before sleep, where a stray thought can feel enormous, where a worry you'd shrug off at noon suddenly feels unbearable at midnight, where an idea can arrive out of nowhere with a clarity your daytime brain never manages. That's not your imagination being dramatic. That's the gatekeeper stepping aside, and whatever you feed your mind in that window walking straight through the open door, unchecked. Here's the part almost nobody tells you, and it's worth sitting with. This isn't a fringe idea dreamed up by wellness culture. Thomas Edison famously used a version of this state on purpose, dozing in a chair holding a set of steel balls, so that the moment he slipped fully into sleep, his hand would relax, the balls would clatter to the floor, and he'd wake himself just enough to capture whatever had surfaced in that drowsy, half-conscious minute. Salvador Dali did something almost identical, using a key instead of steel balls. Neither man was chasing rest. They were chasing that narrow window where the analytical mind lets go and something else, quieter and less guarded, gets to speak. Napoleon Hill understood a version of this decades before neuroscience had the tools to measure brainwaves, and he built one of his central teachings directly around it. He described the subconscious mind as a field that never stops working. It doesn't distinguish between a thought you deliberately plant and a thought that simply wandered in and made itself comfortable. It accepts what you feed it, especially when that feeding happens with real emotion behind it, and it goes to work on that instruction whether or not you're paying attention. He called the deliberate version of this feeding autosuggestion, and he was specific that the state just before sleep, along with the state just after waking, was when the subconscious was most receptive of all, not because of anything mystical, but because the usual defenses, the ones that spend all day filtering and arguing and doubting, simply weren't standing guard. Think about what that actually means for your ordinary nights. Most people fall asleep the way they'd absent-mindedly leave a door unlocked, not on purpose, just out of habit, without ever considering what might wander through while they're not watching. They lie down replaying the argument from work. They scroll through numbers in a bank account that make their stomach tighten. They fall asleep rehearsing the exact sentence they're afraid is true about their own life. I'll never get ahead. This is just how it is for people like me. And that sentence walks straight through the open door, past a gatekeeper who's already clocked out for the night, and settles in for 8 hours of uncontested residence. Nobody sits down and decides to sabotage their own subconscious every night. It happens by default, simply because nobody ever told them the door was open in the first place, or that what walks through it during those unguarded minutes doesn't disappear with the light of morning. It gets filed. It gets referenced. It quietly shapes which opportunities your mind even lets you notice the next day, and which ones it filters out before you're consciously aware they existed at all. There's a specific reason I'm telling you this now, before we go any further, and it isn't to alarm you. It's because once you know the door is open every single night, whether you like it or not, you're left with exactly one decision, and it's simpler than almost anything else in this video. You can keep leaving it open by accident to whatever wandered in from a hard day, or you can start deciding deliberately what walks through it instead, which is precisely the discipline Hill spent an enormous part of his working life trying to teach people, most of whom never fully understood why it mattered until they'd already wasted years leaving the door open to the wrong thing. What goes through that door matters more than most people ever suspect. But how it goes through matters just as much, and that's where most people who've heard of this idea get it wrong, usually in the very first attempt they ever make. Here's where most people who've heard a version of this idea get it wrong, and it isn't a small mistake. It's the difference between a technique that quietly reshapes a life over months and one that gets tried for 3 nights and abandoned as nonsense. They think the words are the whole thing. They lie in bed, repeat a sentence like, "I am wealthy," or "money flows to me easily," a dozen times, flat, mechanical, the way you'd recite a phone number you're trying to memorize, and then they wonder, a week later, why nothing feels different. I want to be honest with you about why that version doesn't work, because it isn't that the principle is false. It's that they've used the door without understanding what actually passes through it cleanly. Your subconscious mind, according to everything Hill observed and wrote about across decades of studying people who'd built real fortunes from nothing, doesn't respond to words on their own. It responds to feeling. A sentence repeated without emotion is just noise. Background static the mind barely registers, filed away with the same weight as a jingle from a commercial you weren't even paying attention to. But a sentence repeated with real feeling behind it, especially in that drowsy window where the gatekeeper has already stepped back, doesn't get filed as background noise at all. It gets filed as something closer to memory, not a wish, not a hope, something closer in the mind's private filing system to an event that already happened. This is where it gets genuinely strange, and I want you to sit with it rather than rushing past it, because this single fact is the hinge the entire rest of this video turns on. Your brain, in that relaxed, half-conscious state, has a documented difficulty telling the difference between something vividly imagined and something actually lived. This isn't a metaphor. It shows up in the way mental rehearsal affects performance in fields where it's been studied closely for years. Athletes who spend time vividly imagining a perfect free throw, feeling the ball leave their fingers, seeing it drop through the net, show measurable improvement in actual performance, sometimes nearly matching gains from physical practice alone. The muscles don't know the difference between rehearsing the motion and running it. And in that same way, in that same drowsy window, your subconscious doesn't fully distinguish between a scene you're deliberately imagining with real feeling and a scene you actually lived through that day. Which means the flat, robotic version, repeating, "I am wealthy," like a shopping list, never had a chance, not because the words were wrong, but because there was nothing behind them for the mind to mistake for reality. No image, no feeling, no scene it could file as lived experience. Just a sentence, dressed up as a technique, doing almost nothing. I think about a man I came across while putting this together, Someone who'd tried this exact practice for years without much to show for it, the flat, mechanical version, before he changed one single thing. Instead of repeating a sentence about being wealthy, he started, every night in that same drowsy window, picturing one specific scene in complete detail. Not a vague fortune, but the exact moment of opening a particular account and seeing a particular number, the weight of the phone in his hand, the light in the room, even the small, ordinary relief in his own chest as he looked at it. Not once, every night, the same scene, built a little more vividly each time, held with real feeling rather than recited like a formula. He told me, and I have no way to verify this beyond his own account, so take it as one man's experience rather than proof of anything, that within a season, decisions that used to feel impossible started feeling merely difficult, and difficult decisions started feeling like the obvious next step. Nothing about his actual bank account changed that first week. What changed, he said, was which opportunities he even let himself notice walking past every day, and which ones he used to filter out before they'd fully registered. That's the part Hill was pointing at when he talked about impressing an idea on the subconscious mind with feeling, not just repetition. He wasn't describing a magic phrase. He was describing a rehearsal, a scene lived so vividly, with such real emotion, in a state where the mind's defenses were already down, that it got filed alongside your actual memories instead of alongside the noise you scroll past all day and forget by lunch. Here's the surprising part, the one most people never expect. The specific words you use in that window matter far less than most people assume. What matters is the scene, and the feeling inside the scene, held steadily enough and often enough that your mind stops treating it as fiction. Which means the real skill isn't finding the perfect sentence to repeat. It's building a picture detailed enough and felt deeply enough that something in you starts treating it the way it treats a memory of something that already happened. There's one more piece to this, though, and it's the piece that changes everything about how this actually works in practice. Because building that scene alone in the dark, in silence, produces a completely different result than building it and then describing it out loud to someone else the next morning over coffee. Those two versions look almost identical from the outside. They are not the same practice at all. There's a reason repetition matters here, and it isn't superstition. It's closer to construction. Every time you replay that scene in your mind, with real feeling attached, you're not just entertaining a thought and letting it dissolve. You're reinforcing an actual pathway inside your brain. Neuroscientists who study neuroplasticity have shown, again and again, that the brain physically strengthens the connections it uses most, whether those connections were built by something you did in the world or something you only rehearsed in your mind with enough vividness and enough feeling. Practice, in the most literal sense your nervous system understands, doesn't require the event to have actually happened yet. It only requires the rehearsal to feel real enough, often enough, for the brain to start treating the pathway as one worth keeping. That's what one repeated night in that drowsy window is actually doing underneath the surface. It isn't wishful thinking floating off into nothing. It's construction work, brick by brick, mostly invisible, happening in a state where you're too relaxed to interfere with your own doubts. The first night, the scene feels thin, almost embarrassing to imagine, the way any new skill feels clumsy the first few times you attempt it. By the 10th night, something shifts. The scene stops requiring effort to hold. It starts arriving on its own, the way a familiar street arrives in your mind without you having to consciously navigate it turn by turn. That ease isn't your imagination getting lazier. It's the pathway getting stronger, precisely the way a path through tall grass gets easier to walk each time someone walks it, until eventually it isn't grass anymore. It's simply the way through. I think about a woman who described this to me in terms I haven't been able to shake since. She'd spent years, by her own account, falling asleep reviewing her bills, replaying the exact monthly shortfall in her head like a private, nightly punishment She didn't realize she was choosing to inflict on herself. She switched the scene deliberately, not to something wildly unrealistic, but to a specific, modest, achievable image of paying off one particular debt, feeling the relief of that one call to the collections office finally being over. She held that scene, with real feeling, most nights, for a little over 2 months. She told me the debt itself didn't vanish on its own, and she was careful to say that clearly, because she didn't want to oversell what happened to her. What changed, she said, was that she started noticing extra shifts she'd have normally been too tired to take, started cutting one specific unnecessary expense without it feeling like deprivation, started making a dozen small, unremarkable decisions that, stacked together over 2 months, actually closed the gap. Nothing magical happened to her bank account while she slept. What happened while she slept was that her mind quietly started treating that outcome as familiar territory instead of foreign ground. And familiar territory is always easier to walk toward than a place you've never let yourself imagine standing. This is the part of Hill's teaching that gets flattened the most in the version most people have heard secondhand. He wasn't describing a passive fantasy that does the work for you while you do nothing. He was describing a mind that, once it treats a specific outcome as familiar and expected rather than foreign and unlikely, starts noticing the ordinary, unglamorous steps toward it that it used to filter out entirely. The extra shift, the smaller expense, the honest conversation with a manager that used to feel too risky to attempt. The rehearsal doesn't replace the walking. It changes which direction your feet start pointing before you've even consciously decided to move them. I want you to actually choose your scene tonight, not someday, not after you've finished this video and moved on to something else. Something specific, something modest enough to feel possible and meaningful enough to actually matter to you. Not a vague fortune, a particular moment, with particular details, held with real feeling in that window right before sleep takes you. And before you go any further in this video, I want you to do something small, right now, that I think will matter more than it sounds like it should. If you're ready to start feeding your mind a deliberate scene instead of whatever wandered in from a hard day, write "I attract wealth" in the comments below. Not as a slogan to scroll past, as the first honest rehearsal of the sentence you're choosing on purpose, in front of other people, before you've even tried the technique for yourself. I read every one. And there's something to what happens the moment you commit to a thing out loud, in writing, before you've proven it to yourself in private. Though I promise you, by the end of this video, exactly why that particular kind of out loud is different from the kind I'm about to warn you against. Here's the distinction I promised you, and it's the reason the title of this video isn't an accident. There's a specific kind of telling that helps you. A single word typed in a comment, a private commitment made once, deliberately, that exists mostly to mark the moment you decided something. And there's a completely different kind of telling that quietly works against everything you just spent the last 10 minutes learning how to build. Most people never separate these two, and it costs them more than they realize. Picture the version of this most people actually do. Someone decides, genuinely, with real excitement, that this is the year things change. And instead of quietly building the scene we just talked about, night after night, in private, they announce it. To the family at dinner, to co-workers on a smoke break, to an entire group chat, in detail, with real enthusiasm. The business they're going to start, the debt they're going to clear, the life they're finally going to build. Everyone nods. Everyone says how proud they are. It feels, in that exact moment, like real progress. It feels like momentum. Researchers who study goal pursuit have documented something almost cruel hiding underneath that warm feeling. And it's worth understanding precisely, because it explains a pattern you've almost certainly lived through yourself without ever having a name for it. When you state an intention publicly and receive social recognition for it, the nodding, the praise, the "I'm so proud of you," some part of your mind registers that recognition as partial completion of the goal itself, even though you haven't actually done anything yet. Psychologists sometimes call this a premature sense of completeness. The identity you were chasing, the person who starts the business, who clears the debt, who finally changes, gets a small, real dose of social confirmation before a single action has been taken to earn it. And because your mind, in certain ways, treats social confirmation as evidence, that early taste of already becoming, that person quietly reduces the internal pressure to actually go do the work. You got a piece of the reward. Why chase the rest as urgently? This is precisely what Hill was warning against, decades before anyone had a name like premature completeness for it, when he insisted that a person's definite purpose should be discussed with almost no one, not out of secrecy for its own sake, not out of paranoia, but because he'd watched, over and over, in the hundreds of people he studied, what happened to a plan the moment it was exposed to casual conversation. He wasn't only worried about doubters, though doubters do real damage, planting a seed of hesitation in a decision that needed to stay settled. He was pointing at something quieter and, in a way, more dangerous, that even warm, supportive, well-meaning attention can drain the exact tension a goal needs to actually get built, because some of that tension gets released the moment other people start treating you as though you'd already arrived. I think about a man I heard about through this project, someone who announced, at length, at a family gathering, that he was finally going to leave his job and build the consulting business he'd been talking about for years. Everyone was thrilled for him. His mother told her friends. His brother mentioned it to people at work. For about 3 weeks, he felt like a different person, buoyed by all of it, riding a kind of borrowed momentum that felt indistinguishable from real progress. And then, quietly, the calls to build his client list slowed down. The website he'd talked about stayed half-finished. A year later, he still had the job. Nothing had technically failed. Nothing had technically happened at all, and I think that's the part worth sitting with. The announcement had given him such a full, warm sense of already being the person he wanted to become that the actual becoming somehow never felt as urgent afterward. Compare that to a woman who told almost no one what she was building for the better part of a year. Not out of shame, out of instinct, she told me later, though she couldn't fully explain where the instinct came from at the time. She kept her plan between herself and one person she trusted completely, and otherwise built it in something close to total silence. No announcements, no group chat updates, no dinner table declarations. By the time anyone else found out what she'd actually built, it was already standing, finished enough to speak for itself. She told me the silence hadn't felt like hiding. It had felt, she said, like keeping all the pressure aimed at the one place it actually belonged. Those two people wanted almost the exact same thing. One of them borrowed the feeling of having it before he'd earned a single piece of it. The other one refused to borrow anything, and let the actual building supply every ounce of satisfaction she felt, which is precisely why, by the time we reach the exact practice I promised you at the start of this video, you're going to understand why the silence isn't a minor detail sitting on the side of the technique. It's load-bearing. Remove it, and the entire structure quietly starts to lean. Here it is, the exact thing you came for, laid out plainly, no more circling around it. Start with your body first, not your mind, because a racing mind rarely settles just because you've told it to. Lie down the way you normally would, and instead of chasing sleep directly, spend the first minute or two simply noticing tension leaving each part of your body in turn. Your jaw, your shoulders, your hands, the small muscles around your eyes you don't usually think about at all. You're not meditating in any formal sense. You're just giving the analytical mind one simple, physical task, so it has somewhere quiet to rest instead of immediately reaching for tomorrow's to-do list. Once your body has settled, bring in the scene you chose earlier, the specific one, not a vague wish. Build it slowly, with real texture. What do you see in front of you in that moment? What's in your hand? What's the temperature of the room? Who's near you? What does your own face look like in that moment of arrival? Hold it the way you'd hold a memory you were fond of, not the way you'd recite an instruction. And underneath the images, let yourself actually feel the thing you'd feel if it were real, not performed excitement, but the quieter, steadier feeling of relief, of arrival, of a weight finally set down. Hill was specific about this exact detail in his own writing, describing a practice of composing a clear, written statement of exactly what you intend to acquire, reading it aloud with real feeling, morning and night. And this is the part almost everyone skips, actually seeing and feeling yourself already in possession of it while you do. Not hoping for it, not requesting it, inhabiting it, briefly, on purpose, with your whole attention. You don't need elaborate wording for this. One honest sentence is enough, spoken quietly or simply felt. Once the scene is vivid, something as plain as this is already becoming true, or thank you, it's here. The sentence isn't doing the work by itself, the way we already covered. It's a small anchor sitting on top of a scene your nervous system is busy treating as real. Then, and this is the part most people rush past because they're impatient for a result, you let it go. You don't lie there interrogating whether it worked. You don't check your own feelings for proof. You let the scene dissolve into ordinary drowsiness, the same way any thought dissolves right before sleep takes you, and you let sleep finish the rest of the work without your supervision. That's the technique. 11 minutes, some nights closer to 15, some nights barely 6 before sleep simply arrives on its own schedule. Nothing about it requires special equipment, a certain time of year, or a particular kind of person. What it requires, entirely, is the one thing Block 5 was actually about, that you do it without narrating it to anyone. Here's why, stated as plainly as I can put it. The moment you tell someone the specific scene you're building, you invite their face into the room with you the next night. Their raised eyebrow, their gentle, well-meaning doubt, their question about how realistic that timeline actually is. You may not even notice it happening, but the next time you try to build that scene in the dark, some part of your attention is now managing their reaction instead of simply inhabiting the moment. Hill wasn't vague about this. He was direct that a person's definite purpose belonged to a small, trusted circle at most, chosen specifically for their sympathy and their capacity for genuine understanding, and to almost no one beyond that, because exposing a plan still forming to casual conversation, however well-intentioned, quietly changes the plan itself, whether the person doing the talking notices the change happening or not. Silence, in this specific context, isn't secrecy for its own sake, and it isn't superstition either. It's protection for something still under construction, in the exact way you wouldn't invite strangers to wander through a house while the foundation is still curing. Let it set. Let it hold its own shape for a while, built out of nothing but your own private attention, night after night, before you ever let another person's opinion anywhere near it. I want to tell you what happened the first time I actually tried this myself, because I didn't believe it would do anything, and the reason I changed my mind wasn't what you'd expect. I tried it for the first time on an ordinary Tuesday, mostly out of professional obligation, the way you test a recipe before you'd ever recommend it to someone else. I didn't expect anything. If I'm honest, some small, tired part of me expected to feel a little embarrassed, lying there in the dark building a scene like a child telling myself a bedtime story about money. The first few nights were exactly as unremarkable as I assumed they'd be. I'd build the scene, lose the thread halfway through, catch myself thinking about an email I hadn't answered, and drift off without much ceremony. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden clarity, no chills, no sense of destiny arriving on schedule. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lot of people try something like this expecting fireworks on night one, and when the fireworks don't come, they decide the whole thing is nonsense and never give it the runway it actually needs. Somewhere around the second week, something small shifted, and it wasn't the thing I expected at all. I wasn't lying in bed one night, suddenly overcome with certainty about my future. I was standing in a grocery store on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, nowhere near sleep, nowhere near any deliberate practice, and I noticed I was doing math in my head about a decision I'd been avoiding for months, quietly, calmly, the way you'd think through a problem that no longer scared you. It took me a full minute to realize what had actually happened. The decision hadn't gotten easier because circumstances had changed. Nothing external had moved at all. It had gotten easier because some part of my mind had apparently started treating a version of that decision as familiar territory, the way you'd navigate a room you'd walked through many times in the dark, without needing the lights on to find your way. That's the part nobody had warned me about, and it's the part one think matters more than any dramatic breakthrough would have. The change didn't arrive as a feeling during the practice itself. It arrived sideways, in an ordinary moment, disguised as nothing more than slightly easier thinking. I've come to believe that's actually how most of this works. For most people, almost all of the time, not as a lightning bolt at midnight, but as a gradual softening of resistance around decisions that used to feel too large to approach, until one day you're standing in a grocery store doing math you'd have avoided completely a month earlier. I kept it to myself the entire time, partly because Block 5 had already convinced me to, and partly, if I'm honest, because I didn't yet have anything worth reporting. There was no story to tell at week 2. There was only a quiet, private practice that felt a little silly most nights, and one grocery store afternoon that felt like nothing at the time and looked like everything in hindsight. I think that's exactly why the silence mattered as much as it did. If I'd told someone in week 1, I'd have had to defend an experiment that hadn't produced anything yet, against a reasonable question I didn't have a good answer for, and defending an unfinished thing, out loud, to a skeptical audience, has a way of talking you out of it before it's had a real chance to work. I'm not telling you this because I think my grocery store moment proves some universal law. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the honest, unglamorous version of how this actually unfolds, rather than a polished story engineered to sound more convincing than the truth. It doesn't arrive as certainty. It arrives as slightly less resistance, repeated often enough, in enough ordinary moments, that eventually the resistance you used to carry everywhere simply isn't there to notice anymore. I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, and I thought the same thing myself before that grocery store afternoon ever happened. Isn't this just an elaborate, well-dressed way of telling yourself a comforting story instead of doing the work? I think that question deserves a real answer, not a dismissal. So let's actually sit with it honestly, because the difference between this and wishful thinking is smaller than you'd hope and larger than you'd fear. Here's the honest answer, and I'm not going to dress it up to sound more mystical than it is. You're right to be suspicious of anything that sounds like you can simply picture a life and skip the part where you actually build it. That suspicion is healthy, and I'd be lying if I told you visualization alone, done in isolation, has ever made anyone wealthy. Hill never claimed that either, even though the shallow, secondhand version of his work sometimes gets flattened into exactly that message. If you read what he actually wrote, the process he described was never visualization on its own. It was a specific sequence, a clear, definite goal, a definite plan for achieving it, persistent action on that plan, and, running underneath all three, this practice of impressing the goal so deeply on the subconscious mind that it stops feeling foreign and starts feeling like home. Remove any one piece and the whole thing stops working. Remove the plan and the action, and what's left is exactly what you're worried it is. A comforting story you tell yourself at night that changes nothing about your Tuesday afternoon. What the sleep practice actually does, and I want to be precise about this rather than overselling it, isn't manufacturing money out of imagination. It's changing what you notice. There's a real, well-documented function of attention where your brain constantly filters an overwhelming amount of information down to the small fraction it actually lets into your conscious awareness, based largely on what it's already decided matters to you. You've experienced a simple version of this yourself. Buy a particular car, and suddenly you notice that exact model everywhere, not because more of them appeared on the road overnight, but because your attention finally started letting them through. That filtering mechanism doesn't know the difference between a car you bought and an opportunity you've been quietly, repeatedly rehearsing as familiar in that window before sleep. Once your mind treats a certain kind of opportunity as relevant to you, it starts letting more of it through the filter. The conversation you'd normally tune out, the offhand comment from a coworker, the ordinary Tuesday that turns out to contain exactly the opening you needed and would have walked straight past a month earlier. That's the honest mechanism, not manifestation in the sense of things appearing from nowhere. Recognition, sharpened, night after night, until you start seeing doors that were standing open the entire time, in plain sight, simply outside the narrow beam of what your attention had been trained to consider possible. I met two men at different points who'd both tried this exact practice, and their outcomes couldn't have been more different, for a reason that has nothing to do with luck. The first one built his scene faithfully every night for months, and did almost nothing else. He didn't update his resume. He didn't reach out to anyone. He waited, quietly, for the feeling of arrival to somehow produce the arrival itself. And a year later, understandably frustrated, he told me the whole thing was a waste of time. He wasn't wrong about his own results. He was wrong about what the practice was ever supposed to do on its own. The second man did the identical nightly practice and treated every sharpened notice the next day as an instruction rather than a coincidence. A conversation at a barbecue mentioned an opening at a company he'd never have considered a year earlier. He actually followed up the next morning, instead of letting the thought evaporate the way it once would have. A newsletter he almost deleted contained a detail relevant to a plan he'd been quietly building. He actually read it instead of scrolling past. None of these moments felt dramatic in the instant they happened. Every single one of them was small enough to dismiss as nothing, the way the first man's version of these same moments probably had been too. The difference wasn't the nightly practice. Both men did that faithfully. The difference was that one of them treated the sharpened attention as raw material for action, and the other treated it as the finish line all by itself. I want that distinction sitting clearly in your mind before we go any further, because it's the exact thing that separates this from wishful thinking, and it's the exact thing most people quietly get backwards. The 11 minutes before sleep aren't where the work happens. They're where the noticing gets built. The work still happens in daylight, in ordinary decisions, in the follow-up phone call you make the next morning instead of letting the impulse fade by lunchtime. Skip that part, and you've built a beautifully vivid scene that will remain exactly that. A scene, admired nightly, changing nothing. There's a story I've been saving for exactly this point in the video, because it shows what happens when this entire principle gets applied not to money at all, but to something far more fragile, a belief held so carefully and protected from so much well-meaning doubt that it changed what a doctor had already called permanent. Napoleon Hill's son, Blair, was born without ears, not deformed ones, none at all, and no auditory nerve to connect what wasn't there to a brain that would never receive a normal signal from it. The doctors examined him and told Hill plainly what they believed to be true. The boy would be deaf for the rest of his life, and very likely mute as well, since children who never hear language typically never learn to reliably produce it either. That was the medical reality Hill was handed in the first days of his son's life, delivered by people with every right to know what they were talking about. Hill refused to accept it as the final word, and what he did next is the part of the story most people skip past too quickly, because they're rushing toward the happy ending instead of sitting with the discipline it actually required. He didn't simply hope. He made a decision, deliberately, about exactly who would be allowed near his son's developing sense of what he was and wasn't capable of. He would not let anyone speak of the boy as deaf in his presence. He would not let sympathy, even warm, well-intentioned sympathy, become the atmosphere the child grew up breathing. He and his wife worked to plant, again and again, the belief that Blair would hear and speak normally, close to the boy's ear, near the bone, in the quiet minutes of ordinary life. refusing every instinct to protect him with lowered expectations instead of raised ones. This is where the story connects directly to everything we've covered tonight, and I want you to notice it precisely, because it isn't a coincidence. A well-meaning nurse involved in the boy's early care suggested, reasonably, that the family begin teaching him sign language to prepare him for the reality everyone else could see plainly in front of them. Hill declined, not because he doubted the nurse's competence, and not because he was in denial about what the doctors had found. He declined because he understood, instinctively, exactly what Block 5 of this video spent time explaining with modern research behind it, that every well-meaning voice allowed close to a belief still under construction changes the belief itself, whether or not the person offering that voice means any harm at all. Sign language, taught early, would have been a quiet, reasonable vote for permanent silence, cast by someone who loved the boy and wanted only to help him. Hill kept that vote out of the room entirely, along with every other voice that might have cast one like it. I don't want to oversell what happened next into something it wasn't. Blair Hill did not wake up one morning with ordinary hearing. What happened was slower and, in its own way, more remarkable than a miracle would have been. Through bone conduction, sound reaching his inner mechanisms through vibration rather than through the missing structures doctors had written off entirely, he began, gradually, to develop a functional degree of hearing that no physician examining him at birth had thought possible. He learned to speak. He attended ordinary school alongside hearing children, not a specialized institution built around the assumption of permanent silence. And as an adult, by his own account and his father's, he went on to work within the hearing aid industry himself, helping other children carrying the same diagnosis he'd once carried, at an age when he was old enough to understand exactly what his parents had refused to let the world convince him he was. I tell you this story not because your situation tonight involves anything close to what that family faced, and I don't want to cheapen what they went through by suggesting the two things sit on the same scale. I tell you this because it's the clearest example available of the exact principle underneath everything in this video, stripped of anything to do with money at all. A belief, protected carefully from voices that would have reasonably, lovingly, worn it down, held in silence, repeated with real feeling, night after night, for years, not weeks, became something a room full of doctors had already ruled impossible. If that principle can move something a medical examination called permanent, I don't think it's dramatic to say it can move a bank account, a career, a version of your own life you've been told, gently or otherwise, to stop expecting. What it requires is the same discipline that family exercised long before there was any evidence it was working, protecting the belief before it's earned anyone else's confidence, especially your own. Here's exactly how to build that same discipline into your own nights, starting tonight, in a way specific enough that you won't be left wondering 3 days from now whether you did it right. Start with the scene itself, because everything else in this practice depends on having one specific enough to actually hold. Not financial freedom, in the abstract, a single, concrete moment. The number on a specific screen. The particular relief of a particular bill marked paid. The exact conversation where you tell someone specific news you've been waiting to deliver. Spend 5 honest minutes, right now if you can, choosing yours. Vague scenes produce vague results. Mostly because there's nothing detailed enough for your mind to mistake for a real memory. Once you have it, write it down. A few sentences, no more, in your own words, in whatever notebook or private note only you will ever open. This mirrors exactly what Hill described doing with his own definite purpose, reading it with real feeling both at night and again in the morning. And there's a reason the written version matters, even though you won't be reading it aloud during the actual sleep practice. Writing it forces precision. It's much harder to stay vague on paper than in your own head, where half-formed wishes can hide comfortably for years without ever being examined closely enough to notice they were never specific to begin with. At night, do the body first. A minute or two of simply noticing tension leave your jaw, your shoulders, your hands, before you try to hold any image at all. Skipping this step is the most common reason people give up on the practice within a week. They try to force a vivid scene onto a mind still running at full daytime speed. It feels effortful and fake, and they conclude the whole thing doesn't work for them specifically. It isn't that it doesn't work. It's that they skip the part that makes the door actually open. Then build the scene, slowly, the way you'd return to a favorite memory rather than the way you'd cram for an exam. Let the details fill in one at a time instead of forcing them all at once. Attach the one honest sentence, quietly, once the scene has some real texture to it. And then, deliberately, let it go. Don't lie there testing whether you believe it. Don't interrogate the feeling for proof it's working. That interrogation is exactly the kind of daytime, analytical activity the whole practice is designed to bypass, and dragging it back in at the last moment undoes most of what the relaxed state was accomplishing. In the morning, before you reach for your phone, before the day's actual demands start crowding in, spend 30 seconds reading what you wrote the night before, silently, with as much of that same feeling as you can recover from sleep. This is the piece almost everyone forgets, and it matters more than people expect, because it bookends the day with the same instruction instead of leaving 18 waking hours for doubt to quietly undo what the night built. Here's the part specific to tonight's video, and I want to say it plainly one more time so there's no ambiguity about how to actually apply it. Keep a private log if it helps you stay consistent. A simple line each morning, noting whether you did the practice, nothing more elaborate than that. But keep it somewhere no one else will read it, and resist every urge to narrate your progress to anyone, including the people who love you most and would genuinely celebrate it with you. Not forever. Once something is built, standing on its own, finished enough to speak for itself the way that woman's business eventually did, sharing it costs you nothing at all. The danger sits specifically in the unfinished middle, the exact stretch where a plan is still fragile enough that someone else's opinion, however kind, could still reshape it before it's had the chance to set. Give it real time before you judge whether it's working. Not 3 nights. A season. The way the woman clearing her debt gave it 2 months before anything measurable changed. The way the man in the grocery store didn't notice his own shift until roughly 2 weeks in, sideways, in a moment that had nothing to do with the practice itself. If you're checking for proof every single morning, you're still doing the analytical, daytime version of this work, the same version that never worked for anyone lying in bed reciting a flat sentence like a grocery list. Let it build the way the pathway through tall grass builds, quietly, underneath your notice, until one day the walking simply isn't effortful anymore. That's the entire practice, complete, nothing hidden or held back for a later video. What's left isn't a technique. It's a decision about whether you're willing to give something 11 quiet minutes a night, for longer than feels reasonable, before you're allowed to know whether it worked. I want you to think, for a moment, about your own version of that doctor's verdict, because you have one, whether or not anyone ever said it to you in a clinical room with a chart in their hands. Maybe it was a parent, tired after a long shift, saying money just doesn't come easily to people like us, meant as comfort, landing instead as a sentence you carried for 30 years without ever questioning where it came from. Maybe it was a bank statement, at a particular age, that convinced you certain kinds of lives simply weren't built for people who started where you started. Maybe nobody ever said it out loud at all, and you arrived at the verdict yourself, quietly, the way you arrive at most of the beliefs that actually run your life. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through years of small, accumulated evidence you stopped questioning long before you were old enough to know you should. Whatever it was, somebody, or something, or some slow accumulation of ordinary disappointment, examined your life at some point and delivered a verdict about what was and wasn't possible for you. And most people, understandably, accept that verdict the way Hill's doctors expected him to accept theirs, reasonably, given the evidence in front of them, and permanently, as though a verdict issued once could never be revisited by anyone, including the person it was issued about. Here's what I want sitting with you tonight. More than any technique, more than any specific step, that verdict was issued by people or circumstances working with the information available to them at the time. It was not issued by the only authority that actually gets to decide what happens in the years still ahead of you. Hill's doctors weren't lying, and they weren't incompetent. They examined what was physically present in a newborn boy and told the truth about what they saw. What they couldn't examine, because it isn't visible on any chart, was what a father was willing to protect in silence for years afterward, past the point where hope alone would have reasonably worn out. You don't need a missing auditory nerve for this to apply to you. You need a sentence you've quietly accepted as fact, the way that family was asked to accept theirs, and a willingness to do something almost nobody does once they've accepted a verdict, build a different one anyway, privately, night after night, without waiting for permission from the evidence currently sitting in front of you. Tonight, when you actually lie down and do this, and I hope you do it tonight, not this weekend, not once things settle down, because things rarely settle down on their own schedule. I want you to notice something in that first attempt. It will probably feel a little foolish. It felt foolish to me too, that first Tuesday, building a scene in the dark like I was telling myself a story I didn't fully believe. That feeling isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's simply what it feels like to plant something before there's any evidence yet that it will grow into anything at all. Every person in this video felt exactly that same foolishness in their own first attempt. The man in the grocery store, the woman clearing her debt, a father in a room refusing to let a nurse teach his son a language built entirely around the assumption of permanent silence. None of them had proof yet. They had a decision, made in private, protected from every reasonable voice that would have talked them out of it. You get to make that same decision tonight, in a much smaller and much more ordinary way, and nobody will ever know you made it unless you choose to tell them. Someday, once it's already standing and doesn't need their belief to survive anymore. I told you, at the very start of this video, that there's a window that opens every single night, whether you notice it or not, and that a small number of people have quietly used it for decades without ever giving it a name. You know what fills that window now? Not a phrase repeated flatly like a phone number. A scene, specific enough to feel real, held with actual feeling, in the exact minutes your mind stops arguing with you long enough to listen. You also know, now, why I asked you to keep tonight's results to yourself, and I don't think that instruction sounds strange to you anymore the way it might have 12 minutes ago. Silence was never about secrecy for its own sake. It was about giving something still under construction the same protection Hill gave a belief a room full of doctors had already ruled impossible, kept away from every reasonable, well-meaning voice that would have gently talked it back down to size before it had the chance to stand on its own. I don't know what your version of that closed-door doctor's verdict actually is. I don't know whose sentence you've been quietly living inside, or how many years you've spent treating it as fact instead of what it actually was. One conclusion, drawn by someone working with limited information, about a future they had no real authority to close on your behalf. What I do know is that you've spent the last several minutes with something most people never get handed plainly in their entire lives. An actual door, a specific window, 11 ordinary minutes a night, and exactly what to put inside them. Some of you wrote, "I attract wealth" in the comments earlier in this video, before you even knew the full practice, before you'd heard about the window, the scene, the silence, or a boy who learned to hear against every reasonable expectation stacked against him. I think there's something worth noticing in that. You committed to something before you had proof it would work, the same way every person in this video did, the same way you're about to do again tonight, lying down in the dark, building a scene nobody else will ever know you built unless you choose, much later, to tell them. That's the whole of it really. Not a technique that does the work for you while you sleep, and not a fantasy dressed up to feel like progress. A rehearsal, repeated quietly, night after night, until your own mind stops treating a better life as foreign territory and starts treating it as the place you already, somehow, know your way around in the dark. I'm not going to tell you what happens after that. I think you already know exactly what happens after that. And I think you knew it the moment I described the difference between the man who waited for the feeling to arrive on its own and the man who followed every sharpened notice out the door and into an ordinary Tuesday that turned out to matter. Tonight, when the house goes quiet and the day finally lets go of you, that window is going to open again, the same way it opens for everyone, every single night, whether they use it or leave it to chance. What walks through it tonight is the only part of this entire video that was ever actually up to you. If tonight is the night that window finally gets used on purpose, follow the channel before you go, because there's more waiting here for the nights ahead. And if you know 5 people still carrying someone else's verdict about their own life, share this with them tonight. Quietly, no explanation needed. Let them find their own 11 minutes the same way you just found yours.